Hello everyone and welcome to the Badan Warisan Malaysia talk series for Spotlight on Sarawak, also known as Talk Sarawak. Today is the fourth installment of our six-part talk on Sarawak's unique and diverse heritage. Spotlight on Sarawak was organized in conjunction with World Heritage Day 2022 and is created by our life members Tan Sri Leo Mugi and Puan Sri Elizabeth, with the support of leading academics and heritage specialists from Malaysia and beyond. We're extremely grateful that we were able to present this program in partnership with Petra Energy and supported by donors Credo Foundation, Cahaya Mata Sarawak Berhad, Private Equity Sdn Berhad, and Centric PR. As Council Member of Badan Warisan Malaysia and a team member of the Talk Sarawak Organising Committee, I have the privilege today to introduce you to AR Mike Boon, our moderator for Dr. John Ting's talk on the forts of Sarawak. Now, Mike is no stranger to Sarawak's heritage nor its architecture. After graduating from the University of Western Australia, he returned in 1990 to Kuching to start his practice. As a founding member and past president of Sarawak's Heritage Society, he has been instrumental in conserving and promoting Sarawak's built heritage, such as the famous Fort Alice in Sarawak and more. Mike has worked closely with Dr. John Ting to restore and catalogue significant historical buildings in Sarawak. I will now hand over to Mike to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. John Ting, who will speak on Sarawak's famous colonial forts. Enjoy.
Thank you, Sarita, for the kind words. Today's speaker, Dr. John Ting, is an architect, researcher, and educator. John obtained his PhD from the University of Melbourne and an architecture degree from RMIT University. He's currently an assistant professor at the University of Canberra, teaching in the architecture and construction programs. When John came back to practice architecture in Kuching in the 90s, he started to gather information on local history and architecture for his PhD research topic. Those research materials form the foundation of his book, The History of Architecture in Sarawak Before Malaysia, that was published in 2018 by PAM Sarawak Chapter and Ting City Sdn Berhad. John's current research continues to investigate Sarawak's architectural history, the vernacular architecture of Malaysia, mobile and prefabricated timber buildings in 19th century colonial Southeast Asia and Australia. Now, before I hand over to John, I would like to remind our audience to send in your questions in the Q&A box. We will try to answer as many as we can at the Q&A session at the end of John's presentation. You can also send your questions and comments in the chat box anytime during the talk. Without further ado, we welcome John Ting to begin his presentation. John?
Thank you very much, Mike. Yes, so today's talk is entitled The Brooke Government's Forts in Sarawak from 1844 to 1938. This was a topic that I started to look at my PhD, but didn't look at all of the forts. So this has become a little bit of an obsession, if you like, over time. And I covered a bit more in my book. And then every day we learn of new things, to new forts pop up that I'm called on to help to identify. Next slide, please. So let me start by talking about Sarawak as it was before James Brooke actually arrived in the area. So before 1841, Northwest Borneo was considered to be part of the Brunei Sultanate, as shown in green. Now you can see that the coast and the rivers are shown in green, and that's because at that time it was about influence over river systems rather than about territory. So really we're talking about people rather than territory. Now the sultanates of Sambas and Pontianak controlled the area to the west of Tanjung Datu, which is you can see on the slide over there, and the Sultan of Sulu controlled the area to the east, which is what is now Sabah. So the Brunei Sultanate was ruled through a sphere of influence over its subjects rather than the occupation of territory. The settlement patterns of Northwest Borneo's inhabitants was all riverine and maritime, as were communications. So there were very few roads, apart from a few walking tracks over mountainous areas. Next slide, please. So Sarawak has a different history to Semenanjung, Malaysia. So if we fast forward 100 years from 1841, when James Brooke arrived in Sarawak, we see that his influence now extended over the entire northwest coast of Borneo. So the rivers and coastline in red was his original area, and then it expanded onto the rivers in orange to the right, and then the rivers in yellow, and then the rivers in blue, the Lawas River in purple, and then the Trusan River in magenta to the right. So what you can see is that over 100 years, well, in fact, until 1905, Sarawak expanded its area, its influence to the entire northwest coast, and reduced Brunei's area to just those green rivers you see on the top right over there. So what happened is when James Brooke came in 1941, he managed to help to put down a rebellion in local rivers, and was then given the title of governor of Sarawak. Now, Sarawak at that stage was just the rivers in red, and him and his nephew and his nephew's son, so Charles Brooke and Varner Brooke, managed to expand Sarawak to its what it is today. So by 1905, we see the Sarawak as we know it today. Now, they ruled in a very interesting way, because after 1849, they ruled without colonial support. So the Brooke Rajahs were ruling as indigenous sovereigns and collaborating with indigenous groups to spread their influence and their jurisdiction. While the government was undeniably under the shadow of British colonialism, it was really through careful and deliberate negotiations and collaborations with both colonial agents and indigenous and migrant groups that they managed to govern and also to expand their state. So really, you can't say that they are actually colonial until the British actually took over in 1945 after World War II. Now, their governance was really a hybridized process, a hybrid of colonial and vernacular processes, and all the production of its architecture also demonstrate this hybridity. So what we'll be doing is looking at the hybrid processes to see how their architecture was produced, in particular the government forts. Next slide, please. At the moment, we know of 48 forts, either from what we can see or what we see in the literature and in the archival material. So what we have here is quite a complex picture, because what we have is in the one location, we can have a succession of different forts, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a tick. And in other cases, you have the one fort building, which actually is erected in one location, then moved to a whole stack of different locations. Now, nowadays, the forts are named after people, but this was not always the case. This only came into practice in the late 19th century. So I will refer the forts in the traditional way, which is by their location rather than their names. So I won't talk about Fort Ellis. I'll actually talk about the Semangang Fort, because Fort Ellis wasn't named as such until the fort had been in that location for quite a while. Next slide, please. So what we're going to be talking about today is really the slides that you can see that are highlighted over here. Those are the ones we know about. The ones that aren't highlighted, we know of them, but we don't really know what they look like, and we don't really know about where they were specifically, and so on. So really, I'm always highlighting more and more as we go through, because I get a lot of people sending me new material on all of this. Next slide, please. This is just a map showing where all those forts are from the 48 forts. So you can see that they spread all over the state of Sarawak. It was a key tool of governance, right? So really, you're telling the story of the forts through the different expansion areas. And really, there were three phases of fort design, if you like. So the first phase was by the first Rajah, James Brooke, who was really establishing forts and experimenting in terms of their architecture. The second phase was under the second Rajah, Charles Brooke, who was standardized the design of forts and really expanded Sarawak in a really major way. And then the third phase was under Viner Brooke, the third Rajah, where forts underwent a lot more institutionalization and also modernization. Next slide, please. So Northwest Borneo in the late in the 1840s was really made up of was really inhabited by Malay groups and also non-Muslim indigenous groups and their settlements. So here we see the example of a Malay settlement of Kuching on the bottom, and the house of high-ranking Malay. And then on the top, we see the Iban Longhouse at Badan. And one thing I should say is that Northwest Borneo was quite a dangerous place at that time. So you can always see palisades and fortifications and also barrages across the river as a way of protecting those communities from being attacked. Next slide, please. So let's start with what is known as Sarawak proper, what used to be known as the first division of Sarawak. So these are the forts of the first of Sarawak proper itself. James Brooke assumed control in 1841, and he had a number of fortified houses, which is a different story, as they're not really forts as we know them today. So when we're talking about forts, we're talking about installations which are also residences, but not necessarily the residence of the Rajah. Okay, so in the past, the fort was the residence and the defensive structure of the Rajah, whereas James Brooke split that, and I talk about that in some length in my book. Now, the first division stretched from Tanjung Datu to the Sadong River. So what we see here is the first Kuching fort on top, and this is a tracing from Charles Grant's book, because the image in Charles Grant's book is very faint. And I believe the building in the middle, the one underneath the flagpole, to be the original Kuching fort of 1844. So you can see that we're starting to have a distinctive kind of architecture, which is different to a Malay house. And on the bottom left, what we see is the Lundu fort, which is essentially a Malay house because it was a much more secure area and they didn't need the protection of palisades. On the bottom right, you see a similar situation to the top image, and that's the fort at Belida, which has a big palisade or timber wall going around it and a number of structures inside. So the forts that were built under James Brooke were actually quite different to each other. If we go to the next slide, please. We can see in the red box that was the original Kuching fort, and then the structures to the right, the little tower, and then the second Kuching fort we can see on the left. So next slide, please. This is another image of the Kuching fort on top from the river. So you can see that pyramidal roof structure, and the structure behind it was the original Kuching fort. So that image was actually a watercolor of Frederick Boyle's that he painted on his 1863 trip to Kuching. Now, that developed over time. So on the bottom right, you can see that the pyramidal roof timber fort is still there, but the original fort in the middle is no longer there. And now there's a rendered brick wall that goes along the outside rather than the timber palisade. So that's a photograph by Alexander Hill Gray of his 1875 trip, or taken during his 1875 trip. Now, in 1879, Charles Brooke actually replaced the timber fort with a brick fort, rendered white brick fort, which you see on the bottom left. And that is what we now see in Kuching. So the architecture you can see is very different between all of the three forts during this time. Now, can I have the next slide, please? So now we move on to the forts of the first expansion area, which is the area known as the second division. So these are the Lupa rivers to the Rajahs rivers and the coastline and little rivers in between. The first one was on the top left, the 1849 Scrung Fort. And this was the way that the Brookes, that James Brooke actually staked his claim to a river. So previously to this, what he used to do is he used to attack the river, attack the people in the river, which he did in 1843 and 44. But because of the way that they operated, they often made strategic retreats and then resettled the rivers once the government was gone. So James Brooke actually adopted the Malay system of building a fort in order to control access up and down the river, which was something that was much more successful for them. Now, in 1851, they built the Kanawat Fort, and on the top right, we actually see the second Kanawat Fort, because the 1851 bamboo fort was actually burnt down, and the two officers there killed. So the second one was actually built out of much more hardy materials, out of Belian, which is the Borneo ironwood, similar to the Scrung Fort, which we see on the top left. Now, on the bottom left, we see the Lingga Fort of 1852, which was the third fort built in this expansion area. And then on the bottom right, we see the 1858 Batong Fort. So what we know about all of these forts is that they were built in hardier materials in Belian. We can see that they start to have these strip of lattice going around the top, where they can see all the way around the building. And we can see that some of them have towers, some of them don't. And we can see that they're also whitewashed as well. So they're starting to have some similarities to each other, but they are still quite distinctive in themselves. So what they are is bringing together indigenous construction systems and vernacular carpentry techniques and materials in their construction. Now, they are not typically colonial buildings. You're not going to see any buildings like this. Famous last words. Someone's going to tell me that they've seen one, but I'm quite sure that this type is very unique to Sarawak. And that is because that they needed local collaboration while they were supposed to look different. Okay, much bigger than a Malay house, but they're not quite as big as a longhouse. Next slide, please. So these buildings actually housed weren't only defensive installations. They also housed the court, the treasury, the pharmacy or the drugstore, the postal, and they were quite often also agricultural stations. So what we see here is the image of the Scrung Fort on the bottom in the frontispiece of Charles Brooks's 10 Years in Sarawak, and then what is possibly the original drawing for it, which was actually done by either Charles Boyle or Arthur Boyle, who accompanied Frederick Boyle on their 1863 trip. And this is the first time that this has been used in a talk. So you guys are lucky in the sense that you actually get to see this image for the first time. Next slide, please. So what they actually did wasn't just about a building. So it was actually about controlling a river. So the settlement pattern is very important. With these three images, what you can see is the location of Scrung on the left, and you can see the existing Malay village at Scrung at the confluence of the Scrung River, which goes off to the top left, and the Lupa River, which is doing a U-turn across the bottom there. So the Scrung River actually had a lot of the government's enemies living in it. So what the government did was they built the Scrung Fort opposite the mouth of the Scrung River on the Lupa River, which you can see in the middle map. And so what happened then is that a settlement, a Malay settlement, then started to appear around the fort. Okay, and likely the people who were living across the river actually moved down to the fort and lived there because the fort's cannons were actually trained on the mouth of the Scrung River. So eventually you got more and more people moving around the fort, so around the protection of the fort, and eventually also you started to see Chinese people building shop houses there to trade. So this pattern of the fort, the Malay kampong, and the Chinese shop houses, the tripartite settlement pattern, started to become a standard thing with the government forts. And they were also settled on one side of the river. So the kampong across the river eventually disappeared with everyone moving to the fort side. Next slide, please. Now, in 1864, something very interesting happened to the Scrung Fort in the sense that it was dismantled and then moved to Semangang. And here we see the Scrung Fort in its reassembled state in Semangang, which was some distance downriver. The reason they moved was that they no longer had any more enemies in the Scrung River, and also the location of Scrung was actually prone to flooding. So they moved the fort to this little hillock on the Scrung River at the Semangang, on the Lupa River at the Semangang River. At that time, it was an uninhabited location, although there are some Chinese graves there indicating that it had been inhabited in the past, possibly by Chinese agriculturalists. Used to be called Sri Aman for many years, and now it's called Semangang again, which makes it much more convenient. Now, the moving of the fort is interesting because it meant that the building was built with mortise and tenon construction, meaning it was built without nails so that it could be dismantled and moved down. Also, we have to remember that there was the ability to move it. While the Brooke government had ships and boats that could do this, Ibans had been doing this for centuries. Because Ibans quite occasionally moved their longhouses from one area to another. When they had overfarmed one area, they would actually dismantle the longhouse, put it on their longboats and move it to a new area which was more fertile and re-establish their longhouses there. Now, I might also say here, just to add to the first lecture about longhouses, that in those days, the main structure for longhouses, the main posts and the main beams, the big pieces of timber that held up the longhouse, were actually considered as pusaka or inheritable heirlooms, which meant that these structures had some spiritual meaning to them, which gave them strength. Okay, so they were very important, and perhaps that's why the government didn't just burn down their fort so it couldn't be used by other people, because that destruction meant a destruction of perhaps the spirits. Next slide, please. So what we can see here is the same series of maps. 1864, we see that it was largely uninhabited. Perhaps it had been cultivated previously with agriculture, but was lying then in fallow. In 1865, then we can start to see that this is after the fort was established. We can start to see that there's an upriver kampong to the right and a downriver kampong to the left. You can see the fort right next to the little rivulet there, and the two red boxes there are actually shop houses that were established there. So we have to remember that everything worked on the river, right? There were no roads at that time. Today, when you reach Semangang, you come from the forest side, not from the river side, because you come by road. But what we can see is that tripartite arrangement by 1880 was growing in the same way. So although we had this modern function in the fort with the courts and the dispensaries and so on, the settlement patterns were still very traditional. or still took into account traditional ways of settlement and didn't adopt the colonial grids like we see in especially in Penang and in Kuala Lumpur. Next slide, please. We can also see this with the construction features. We know that all the materials were local because the Brooke government did not have a lot of money. Okay, so they used their local collaborators to go and source for materials. And we also start to see the emergence of standard details. Now, these standard details are very interesting because if we look at the roof construction, we start to see these king post systems, and also then we see these intermediate beams that are supporting the collar ties. So the collar ties are all the little ones that are going across to the top of the image, and then the intermediate beam is the one that actually supports them. Now, why this is significant is because this is known to be a Malay tradition, a traditional Malay way of making roofs, and not just Malays in Borneo, but Malays all across Nusantara. You can see many examples of this in Semenanjung side and also elsewhere in Southeast Asia. So because of the use of this detail, we know that Malays were involved at least in building the roof, as well as Ibans, because they supplied the belian. Next slide, please. What we can also see is the involvement of other people. So what we see here is two connections, the one on the top being a scarf joint, which is mortised onto the top of a column or of a post, which we see in all of the extant forts, or the forts that are existing. And this is to extend the structure along a building. And then we also see at the corners the hand-in-hand scarf joint, again mortised over a column, right? So these things all fit together very nicely. They fit together quite tight. There may be little timber wedges that are used to actually tighten them if they weren't quite as tight. Now, this has always been believed to be a Chinese form of construction, a standard Chinese vernacular connection, believed by the Chinese in Sarawak as well as many scholars. But I think that my current research is actually suggesting that it is something else. But that maybe can be part of a different talk. So let's have the next slide, please. Now, here we then see the restored and conserved Fort Alice at Semangang, or the Semangang Fort, which I was privileged enough to work on as the consultant architectural historian and also the exhibition designer, and where Mike, our moderator for today, was the conservation architect. So this was a very interesting process where we learned a lot of things about the construction, and this was a logical extension of my PhD research, which was about this building. So really, what we managed to do was manage to reestablish a lot of those details that had been uncovered during our previous research in the restoration and conservation of this building, which is now a regional museum. And I was also involved in making all the display panels of this museum as well. Next slide, please. So now we move on to the third set of forts, which is the forts of the second expansion. So we've just been through the forts of the first expansion, and these are the forts of the second expansion, where we see a lot more standardization. Yeah, this is the Cebu Fort of 1862, and they are and this is the second of the type, right? And we know that there are 4 of these types. I call this type the Bintulu type because it was Bintulu was the first time that this fort type was actually built in Sarawak. So on the top, that is Alexander Hillgray's photo from his 1870s trip. And then we see a new image on the bottom of the Cebu Fort, which was a photograph taken by Margaret Brooke, who was Charles Brooks's wife, so the Rani of Sarawak. And these photographs come from an album that is held in the Sciences Museum at the University of Florence. So I must thank Val Mashman for bringing these Florence photos to my attention, and what a beautiful photograph it is. But you can see that along the top of the white walls, we've got the lattice walls, the lattice strip going across the top, which allows them to see what's happening outside, and also allows them to actually shoot at attackers, if you like. You can see the cannon ports there, which are a bit lower, the big flaps, and then the walls that come all the way to the ground. These things we know are made out of 40 to 50 millimeter thick bullion planks, which are very, very strong. And then they had a rectangular plan, a double pitched roof, and then these corner towers. So in the case of Cebu, this was the only fort on the site. The next slide, please. But in the case of Bintulu, which we see on the bottom slide here, that was actually the first one. That was the first of the Bintulu forts that was built, but it was not the first fort built on the site, because there was a temporary fort that was built there before the Bintulu fort was moved from Kuching to Bintulu to be erected. So we know that the frame was fabricated in Kuching by Chinese carpenters, which adds to the theory of the Chinese detailing. And two of these carpenters actually accompanied John Brooke and also Reverend Francis McDougall to Bintulu to be erected. So here we start to see a system. The frames fabricated in Kuching, you send it out to the location with carpenters who know how to put it together. But we also know that it was from the local people that the roof shingles and the cladding was actually sourced. So we know that this was the way that the Bintulu fort was put together, the Cebu fort, and the Muka fort, which you see on the top of 1863, which was and that's the only photo we have of the Muka fort. So clearly, all of these forts have got a lot of similarities together in terms of their construction, their design, and their materials. So next slide, please. Now, this is a very interesting one, because the last of the Bintulu type of forts, we've seen three, and this is the fourth one, the last one, is the fort at Kapit, which we see on the top image here. Now, this is a very interesting case, because actually the fort on the top was originally built as the ballet fort, which we see in the watercolor on the bottom by Rani Margaret. Again, thanks to Val for bringing this to my attention. That was a very difficult location at the confluence of those two rivers. It was very difficult to land boats there. So that's why they actually moved that fort down to the location of Kapit. So what we can see with the Balai fort on the confluence of the Rajang and Balai rivers is that it doesn't have the corner towers, but it does have the double pitch roof with the upper roof actually popped up to be a room up there. Yeah. So what we can see, what we know is the frame for this fort came from Kuching. So this fort originated in Kuching. It was transported to Balai, where it was erected and stood for 5 years. And after that, it was actually dismantled and then moved down to Kapit to be re-erected. So we have a fort here in three locations, very interesting. But we still see here the solid walls. We still see here the corner turrets, the timber construction, the strip windows. But here they've actually painted it, the bottoms black, because this area used to flood and still floods, so the black was actually a tar to waterproof it. Next slide, please. And we see a few interior shots of this. The courts room on the bottom left, these two images, or that image from the Tunjukka Foundation, and then an image from the British Archives on the right, showing Viner Brooke holding court in the fort. So you can see how these buildings were actually used. Next slide, please. And we get more of an idea here because they also used to live in the fort. So we get some images. This one's from Jason Brooke of how the European residents or the residents used to occupy the fort as a domestic situation. This is also quite tall. We see on the bottom side the ground floor, so it's built quite tall so that could actually be occupied as well. So it's now the Kapit Regional Museum, and this is how you enter into the museum on the ground floor. Next slide, please. So this is a curious fort. This is the 1865 Kabong, sorry, let me start again. This is the 1894 Kabong Fort, which bears a lot of similarities to the Bintulu forts. And the first Kabong Fort in 1865 was demolished, replaced by the second Kabong Fort in 1893, which washed away. And then this fort was built a little bit inland. So it has all the standard features, but it looks different because it no longer has the lattices for the strip window going around it, and it's got some rooms on the end which come down to the ground. Plus, the cladding doesn't actually come down to the ground itself, but the construction of the main structural frame is the same as all the other forts that we have seen so far. Now, next slide, please. What we can see here is the Lubuk Antu Fort of 1868. This is the second one. The first one was burnt down also in 1868. Was established and burnt down in 1868, where they built this one. I believe that this Lubuk Antu Fort was the same plan as the Kabong Fort that we just saw before. Now, this fort was burnt down by Iban collaborators of the Brooke government who were attacking the Japanese who were occupying this fort during the war. And in 1945, the third Lubuk Antu Fort was built on the bottom right, a concrete structure, which is now known as Fort Arundel. And Arundel was a Brooke official who was killed during World War II. Next slide, please. So what we see here then is part of a fort from the third expansion on the Baram River. So this one is at Marudi, and the Baram River was ceded by Brunei to Sarawak in 1883. Marudi Fort has all the same common elements like the strip windows and the cannon ports and the black strip below the white timber, but it has a different plan shape. So it also has all the same carpentry details, but they're starting to go through a few experiments with how these forts can be. You can see that the tower configurations are different, and you get an idea here of how the courtroom was used. We can see that this is very similar to how the courtroom was in the Kapit Fort as well. So it was a versatile construction system which was easy to change, where it was easy to change the plan. So you didn't need to actually stick to a standard plan, and it would still be relatively easy to construct in Kuching and ship it out here. This fort that we see here actually burned down in 1994, and a replica was constructed in 1997, which is what you would see today if you went to Marudi. So these are Charles Hose's images. Next slide, please. Now, this is also part of that expansion, and this one is sorry, this is not part of that expansion, but built during that same time in 1883. This is what we suspect to be the Katibas Watch House, image from the British Archives on the confluence of the Katibas and Rajahs rivers. And here it's a very small image, but you can still see that it's got the hipped roof, it's got the white walls, it's got the lattice, it's got the cannon ports as well. So I wish we knew a bit more about this. But next slide, please. This is the 1884 Balaga Fort, and Balaga is a river that runs off the Rajahs River. These are the images of A.J.N. Richards on the left, courtesy of the Tunjuga Foundation. And on the right, image of Tunjuga himself at the Balaga forts in the 1960s. So here, we know that this is one of the smaller forts, and this fort was unfortunately physically demolished in 1966. But we can see that it's got all the same features again, the timber cladding, the trellis or the lattice strip windows across the top, but slightly different because the towers are at 90 degrees, not at 45 degrees, like many of the other ones. Now, Balaga is a town that has the same pattern as well, and this is probably a good time to introduce the concept. With a lot of these upriver forts, what we see is that the fort is established, and usually the first people to settle in that area are actually downriver Malays that actually come up to settle around the fort because perhaps their relatives are actually working at the fort. And this is certainly true with the case of Balaga and also the case with Kapit, which has a very beautiful Malay kampong there. And so the Malays were not traditionally inhabiting this inland area. Generally, they were pretty close to the coast. And soon after the Malays came, the Chinese would then come and settle. And at this time, both the Malays and the Chinese were traders. It's very important to say that because this is something that is not what is well known in Sarawak. And certainly in the case of Marudi, the first kampong next to Marudi town is actually called Kampong Dagang, which is the business kampong, right? So Malays were going to these areas as traders and also working at the fort, but primarily as traders, otherwise not as agriculturalists. So this is a very different pattern to what we see on the Semenanjung side and also what we see in Sarawak today. Next slide, please. We see the 1885 Trusan Fort on the Trusan River. So by this stage, this is in the fourth expansion of Sarawak. We can see a lot of the similarities here, but we're starting to see a bit of a Dutch gable entry, as well as a different configuration for the roof over here. This fort was demolished quite a while ago, and this is out of Banfield and Baringall's book, History of Sarawak, under its two white Rajahs. Next slide, please. So around that time, things start to get a little different. This is the 1897 Limbang Fort as part of the fourth expansion on the Limbang River. Now we can see that this is looking more like a house rather than a fort because it doesn't have the strip windows, and we can see that it actually has a veranda going around it and looking much more like a residential building. And perhaps this was because this was built as a residence for the Sultan of Brunei when he visited Limbang, and that it doesn't have the same features as all of the other forts. So we're starting to see a change here in 1897. Next slide, please. Now, in the early 20th century, we start to see things that are clearly not forts still being called forts. So the 1929 Tabakang Fort on the top, which is really a simple plan with a brick infill to a Bilian frame, very much like a Chinese farmhouse. But on the same note, we also see the 1937 Maluan Fort, which still has all of the characteristics of a fort. And both of these areas were really quite secure by that time. So it is something quite different that's actually now happening under Viner Brooke's rule. Next slide, please. These are images of the Maluan Fort. You can see the same corner hand in hand, the corner cross top plates on the right and the hand in hand scarves on the top left. And then we can see also the courtroom on the bottom where we see the balustrade, where you would have the court officials sitting behind, and then the public area to the front of it. Now, next slide, please. After 1905, there was no more expansions, right? So the state didn't expand anymore. So we see a few of these Baram forts popping up during that time. So the top right is the second Leo Matu fort of 1938. The first one being built in 1911. On the top left, we see the 1929 second Long Aka fort, the first one being built in 1911. And the Long Aka fort is still there, although it's quite overgrown, I'm told. And the bottom is the 1938 second Long Lama fort, the first one being built in 1928. So we can start to see that forts are starting to change a little bit, although they still have the plans and the general form. They no longer always have the strip windows going around. So now it's a bit more about keeping the weather out. So next slide, please. So that brings us to the end of the talk. We've been through all of the forts that are known about, and we are hoping very much to find out a bit more about the forts as we go on. I've just put my 2 email addresses there in case anybody wants to find out a bit more about it or needs a few more references. I can certainly help you with that. I've also said to Badan Warisan that I will pass over some of my articles to them, so they can share them with you. And these are open access articles, so they'll probably just be the links. And if you want to know a bit more about it, I'm just putting into the chat now a link to the PAM, the Pertubuhan Architect Malaysia online shop. A link for where you can get my book, which I go through a lot of this material. And if you are in KL, I believe that you can just pop into the PAM Center, and maybe Mike Boon can help us on this run. Pop into the new PAM building in Bangsa, where you can pick up a copy of the book. So at this point I'll hand over back to Mike, and Mike can help us with the questions. Oh, sorry, Mike, a question for you before you start. Is it true to say that the PAM Center in KL has copies of my book for sale?
No.
Okay.
Anyway, thanks, John, for your very enlightening presentation. But with regards to your book, you can get a copy from PAM Sarawak chapter, which is in Kuching, or from Ting City in Penang. Right? It's cost slightly more than 100 ringgit. It's really worthwhile. Limited edition. We only printed limited copies. If they run out, it runs out. So it's good for John. I'm doing some promotion here. So it's good for people who are interested really about architecture history or how Kuching or Sarawak being developed in the past. Yeah. But John, before we go through the questions that are being posted, let me see. Okay, I have 2 questions that I see in the Q&A box. But before that, maybe I have one question for you. I hope you can answer for me. I think this is ongoing question every time that we meet. You know, with reference to the hybridized systems, yeah, of government and productions that you spoke about. We also have seen quite similar timber construction details in Sabah, Brunei, Kalimantan, and West Malaysia, which suggested the unique carpentry practice of Borneo. Then, the next what it leads to is, do you think this carpentry tradition has a wider global relationship, particularly in the context of Southeast Asia and Asia? I mean, it is the same question we've been exploring. It's an ongoing research, and we always have something different every time we talk. So would you like to share?
Thank you, Mike. Yes, that's a really good question. Now, when I was doing my PhD, we used to believe, and this is the information from Professor Miles Lewis at Melbourne Uni, we used to believe that it was Chinese carpentry traditions because the carpenters were Chinese. So my latest research is actually looking at the vernacular architecture or the vernacular carpentry of southern China, in particular Guangdong and Fujian, to compare the way that they build their houses, the carpentry that they use, to the carpentry that we see all over Southeast Asia and all over Borneo. And what's really interesting is that it is a very different system that we see in China at that time. Yeah, and we see that a very different system in China at that time. So I believe that the carpenters that came from China at that time had skills in working with wood, but it was the master carpenters that held on to the traditions, and they built traditional buildings in China. They didn't migrate because they had plenty of work, and they were able to support their families. But their workers were the ones that couldn't get ahead, and perhaps they're the ones who left China. Now, when you are a migrant, someone who's very poor and seeking a better life, you're not going to impose what you know on where you're going to arrive at. You're just going to do whatever they tell you to do, right? So this is what I'm thinking. And so what I'm beginning to think now is that the construction system with the hand-in-hand scarf and the cross-top plates is actually much more, it's not a Chinese system, even though the people who practice them are Chinese. And it's been done so long that as you know, when we did the forts, all the Chinese carpenters there believe it was Chinese. But in fact, there's no evidence to show that carpentry system actually came from China. So it may well have come from somewhere else. It is a little bit different to traditional Malay carpentry, so I don't believe that it is Malay. You know, could it be that it is something that developed through a collaboration between colonial groups and Malay groups, and this system actually came up? We need a lot more work in this. We really don't know where it's come from at the moment. I'm pretty confident though that it didn't come from China. And so what we need to do is really study where Malay carpenters came from, because the Malay carpentry of what is now Malaysia is quite different to the Malay carpentry of all the different parts of Indonesia, for instance. So this is still a mystery, Mike, but I think it's a good mystery, right? I'm learning a lot about things that I never thought I'd be interested in, especially with the traditional architecture, traditional carpentry of Fujian and especially of Fujian of the 19th century. So we're learning more and more, and it's also giving us lots of knowledge about how these people migrated and what how they actually worked when they actually got to Malaya and to Sarawak. Because we do know that a lot of traditional carpenters and masons and stonemasons and bricklayers and so on and so forth were imported from China to build temples and shrines and important community buildings. But these are not the people that built the forts or built the everyday houses of the Chinese and the Malays all over the place. So we're making progress, but it's still a mystery.
Thanks, John. I think probably we have to conserve more buildings to find the answer.
Indeed.
I have 3 questions actually I received. I'll go through them with you in the order that I received them. The first question is from James Young, President of Sarawak Heritage Society. He wrote, was the round tower in Kuching once a fort? We know
yes, James, thank you for your questions. I can see in the chat also, Mike. So it is a very interesting building, because Kuching was not going to come under attack when the round tower was built. It was not going to come under attack from outside of Kuching. So the theory is that it was built at the end of Carpenter Street as a symbol to Chinese triads who might be thinking about another rebellion to try and turn over the Sarawak government. So that's the theory at the moment. But it's a very curious building, because it no doubt it looks like a fort from the Rock Road side. But once you walk around the back, it's like a house. there's a veranda, you go up the stairs, and it's completely unlike a fort. So I think it's very symbolic. But I don't know, I haven't yet found any material to suggest why the architecture is what it's like. So I'm sorry, James, I can't help you.
Okay, the second one, this one is easy, John. It's from Gonzalo Silvia. Which are the forts do you advise us to visit? I think the answer is very simple, all of them, right?
Of course, of course. But you know, you're not only visiting a fort, right? You're actually
Yes.
visiting a unique Sarawak settlement, a Sarawak town. So my suggestion is this. My suggestion is fly to Kuching, and then from Kuching you can drive to Semangang. It's about a 3.5 4 hour drive. And you can have a look at the recently conserved and restored Fort Alice that is there, the Semangang Fort, which is now the Semangang Regional Museum. And in there, there's panels that I've done about the history of forts as well as the history of Semangang, which are interesting. So not to say that you only need to go and look at the product of Mike's and my work, but Semangang is a beautiful little town with two fantastic kampongs and then beautiful kampong houses, as well as a whole stack of timber shop houses, old timber shop houses that you can also look at. Semangang, one of the great things about travel is food, right? And Semangang has its own food traditions, has its own noodle traditions. Its Malay food is also quite different to Kuching. So go not only to see the fort, but also to see the fabulous Lupa River, as well as to visit the town, the shop house, the bazaar, and the Malay kampong. They're really friendly people there, and also to eat the lovely food. I would also say that every visitor to Sarawak should go on a longboat, and these things are like planes without wings that are colder than planes and have very loud DVDs being played in the cabin. So very cold aircon. Remember to bring a jacket. Jump on the longboat, on the express boat at Cebu, and go upriver to Kapit, because the Kapit Fort, which is looked after by the Tunjunga Foundation, is another beautiful example of a fort, and has quite a nice display in it. And of course, you can see all of the details that I've spoken about. And Kapit itself is a fabulous little town. It's got a great market where a lot of the indigenous groups come in to sell their non-timber forest products in the market itself. Really beautiful, and great coffee shop culture in Kapit as well. So highly recommended for that. And while we're talking about food, of course, you might think about flying to Marudi, where you can see the facsimile fort house in Marudi, which is quite a beautiful building in itself, as well as experience a completely different coffee shop culture. They have their own form of kway teow in Marudi, and the fried kway teow there is like you can find nowhere else. You see also a lot of indigenous groups who fish the river, bringing in their large live river fish to sell, which you can buy and take to a local Chinese coffee shop to get them to cook it. So if you want to ask me, Semangang, Kapit, Marudi, all forts, all lovely towns, big rivers, and really worth visiting. Very easy to get to.
Hey, John, to add to the Semangang Fort, check out the tourism calendar. Go during Bernard Festival. Okay, John, I think you can answer two questions that's related. First is from Pinky Koo. It's asking about nails. Talking about nails, right? Example about nails. You say in the old days, the constructions are with no nails, but are nails being used? The nails question is very interesting. I know you have answer for that, and that relate to Bruce Head's question or his past. Maritime carpenters on board trade vessels. I think you know how to answer this, right? To you, John.
Yes, so the question about nails is interesting because it's not there were no nails used in the main structural frame of the building, but nails were used to fix the cladding. So the weatherboards the vertical timber cladding. They were used to fix to the main frame. They were used to fix the rafters to the main frame, and then again to fix the Belian shingles to the rafters. But the nails are very interesting because in the history of nails, we know that at that time we were starting to have stamped nails from Europe. So they get a sheet of metal and then have a stamp which basically stamped out these kind of T-shaped plates, which were nails which were used. But we also know that the Brooke governments were very short of money all the time. And they were always trying to find things for their IBAN collaborators to do. Yeah, so and they were trying to always point them away from headhunting and get them to do other things which will fulfill their spiritual requirements for prowess. And also we know that the IBANs and many other indigenous groups are fabulous metal workers. And while you're in Sarawak, going to look at the fort, you must go and buy a local Sarawak barang, which is made out of the leaf spring of a Toyota Hilux. That's another story. And we remember that Ibans as headhunters would always make really high-grade steel weapons. So what the government did was they got their metalworking skills and they got these groups who were making headhunting barangs to make nails. And so these are actually incredibly strong forged steel nails, which were reused over and over again in the fort. So when they moved the fort, they would actually pull out all the nails, save the nails, reuse it in the next fort. They'd throw away all the timber that had split, but they would actually keep the nails. So this is a very interesting tradition of metalwork in Sarawak. And there was the second question, I've forgotten, Mike. What was it? It was
related to maritime.
Yes.
Maritime carpenters and
Yes.
carpenters working on board. Yeah.
Thank you. So this was something that developed over time, and this is although it's an old tradition. So what happened with Europeans in the mid 19th century is they thought that their way was the best, and no one else could do anything. So we see that with Francis McDougall when he came to Sarawak, he actually met up with a German shipbuilder. And it was the German shipbuilder who was the lead carpenter on St. Thomas's Cathedral and also on the Mission House. And he built that with tools that McDougall had brought because, of course, with the European chauvinism that we had at that time, they didn't believe that locals could do anything, right? Which, of course, now we know that they can. So ship's carpenter was actually used to build St. Thomas's Cathedral and the Mission House, but no more than that. And the Brooke governments also built their own boats a bit later on. So they did also use shipbuilders, mostly Malay and Chinese shipbuilders, but they were quite separate to the carpenters that were used on the forts. Yeah, they were quite separate. They were really specific. And there was a division of labor between ship's carpenters, of which there were many, and they were treated quite separately to the carpenters that actually built buildings. So I hope that answers the question. And the other thing, of course, with ships and boats in Sarawak built by the Brooke governments is that they were really keen on building things out of Belian. They built all their boats out of Belian, and I think up until recently, this is still the case. They thought teak was an inferior timber, and that Belian was much, much better, much longer lasting than teak. So that's an interesting little snippet.
Yes, John, I think boat building is another lecture by itself, yeah.
Indeed, yes, indeed, because there's many traditions of boat building in Sarawak as well from all the different groups. We get Iban longboats that can carry 20-meter long posts, for example, across difficult terrain. But yes, that's another lecture altogether.
John, I think the next question from our friend Lim Tek Bang is the first question that we ask when we look at forts. It says, he was curious about ancillary buildings like stores supporting the forts themselves. Were there any remnants of these ancillary structures, or were the spaces incorporated into main fort structures themselves?
Thank you for that, Ben. That's a good question. It was common in those times for cook houses to be separate. It was common at that time for cook houses to be separate because of fire. So they didn't want to expose the fort itself to fire. So they put those things separately. Now the fort, it was originally designed as multi-function building. So you lived there, you worked there, you fought there, you did everything there. It was also a prison, right? As the settlement grew, the people who used to work and live in the fort started to build houses outside. And so they no longer lived in the fort. So in the case of Simangang, Charles Brooke himself, when he was the officer in Simangang, actually built a little house for himself outside, which came to be known as the Simangang Estana. And of course, all the people who worked in the fort, including the soldiers and the garrison, eventually lived outside in barracks outside of the fort as more and more people were involved in these things. So there were many ancillary buildings, but they were not many of them survive. Very few of them survive because they were smaller buildings and they were often upgraded as need came by. So I hope that answers your question, Ben.
All right, I think we have time for 3 more questions. They are all from Michael Quare. I know it's getting late, John. Let's go through this a bit, quickly. Now, Michael wants to know why during Brooke's time, there were no single department overseeing maintenance of all the forts. He's asking. Example, organizing supplies like cannons, consumables. Was there no official records for all the forts? That's the first question he was asking.
Okay, so Mike, thank you for your question. I think if you look at the people who were involved or the structure of the Brooke government in Kuching and in the outstations, it was not a matter of having different departments. Yes, they had many different departments, but the difference between what happened in Sarawak and what happened in Semenanjung side is that often the one officer, the one European officer in and out station would look after all of those departments. So we have correspondence where the Rajah is very keen on keeping on the upkeep of the forts. So he'll write to the resident to say, okay, well, make sure you paint the fort, or have you painted the fort, and where you get the paint from, and make sure it's not too expensive. And just in the next sentence, he'll say, and call our friends from upriver because we're going to go and attack these other people on this other river. So basically, the governments, especially in the outstations and also in Kuching, was very, very compact and very different to colonial governments in Singapore, Penang, and in Semenanjung side in Malaya. So yes, so that's basically it. It was they ran on the smell of an oily rag, very, very compact, very, very cheap. Not to say that he was stingy. He was not stingy when it came. Sorry, I'm talking about Charles Brooke here. He was not stingy when it came to spending money on himself and on his family, but certainly on the government, very stingy. And there's paperwork to back this up. So the other thing is that because Sarawak was not a colony, they were not subject to colonial administrative records. So they were nowhere near as rigorous as the colonial jurisdictions in Malaya. And also a lot of it was destroyed during the war. And also a lot of it has been destroyed subsequently because no one valued it in the 70s and 80s. So I'm sorry to say that we're really trying to retrieve a lot of this stuff when and we were just born too late, Mike, I think.
All right, John. Another question from Michael Kwek. It's about Fort Margherita. I think it is the same question that can be asked on Square Tower. Yeah. He asked, Fort Margherita is outstanding when compared to the others. what was the rationale for the major difference? So it's about
Okay,
timber
so
fort versus the masonry fort.
yes, so there's only two brick forts in Sarawak, and that's the Square Tower and Fort Margarita, and they were symbolic. Yeah, they didn't work as defensive structures because by the time they were built, those kinds of forts wouldn't have stood a chance against naval firepower. But they were actually a symbol for European visitors to Sarawak. Yeah, so they were meant to symbolize the civilization that the Brooke government had brought to Sarawak, and John Walker has written a very interesting a paper about this. Rather than actually being defensive or even institutional facilities, because just to the left of this image you have the Kuching courthouse, which was really the main administrative institutional building, and the Square Tower was a jail, or was part of the jail, and really Fort Margarita was where they did where the garrison did their exercises. So it's really nothing like what we see in the outstations, where there were institutional buildings, but those were actually designed to represent Brooke influence to the locals. So it's a different audience, I think, which is why they look different. And I do write a little bit about this in my book, based on John Walker's research as well. So hopefully we'll be able to add those links all, give those links all to the to Warisan, Badan Warisan to put on their website.
Okay, John, I think the last question from Michael again that would wrap up quite nicely. Apart from the forts, are you also researching the architecture of the Astana and its predecessors buildings, government house?
Okay, no is the short answer, but John Walker has written a very interesting history of the houses, the three houses of James Brooke, and then how Charles Brooke then adapted James Brooke's last house to be the Astana. So there is work being done on it, but not by me, or maybe I should say not yet by me. I would really love to get in there, but this is not something that I've had the opportunity to be involved with as yet.
All right, thank you, John. I know it is well past your dinner time. It's about 8:30 in Sydney. But before we go, I would like to thank everyone for your interest and participation in Spotlight on Sarawak, Talk Sarawak. Also, a big thank you to our major supporter, Petra Energy Berhad, and our other donors, Credo Foundation, Cahaya Mata Sarawak Berhad, Cope Private Equity Sdn Berhad, and Centric PR Sdn Berhad for supporting this endeavor. I'm pleased to hand over to Vanessa of Badan Warisan Malaysia. Thank you and enjoy your evening.
Thank you very much, Mike, for being our gracious and knowledgeable moderator for today's talk. Thank you so much, Dr. John Ting, for sharing your knowledge and providing us with such fascinating insights and the history of Sarawak's forts from the Brooke era. It was wonderful to see so many drawings and beautiful old photos of various forts, as well as discover details of their construction and functions. To our audience, thank you for tuning in for today's talk in our webinar series on Spotlight on Sarawak, and for all your comments and questions. We hope you will join us on Thursday, 23rd of June at 5 p.m. on a talk by Dr. Waylin Jehom on traditional textiles and costumes. If you have not registered for this talk, please visit Badan Warisan Malaysia's website at badanwarisan.org.my. And in the events section, you can register for this talk, as well as the final talk in the Talk Sarawak series that will be held on 7th of July for Sarawak's Endangered Heritage by James Yong, with the closing of the series by Puan Sri Elizabeth Moggy. Please follow us on our website. You can subscribe to our e-newsletter, Jendela Warisan, or follow us on Facebook and Instagram for more information on upcoming events or news on heritage in Malaysia. Badan Warisan Malaysia is an independent non-government organization, and we do not receive any financial support from the government. If you have enjoyed today's talk and wish to support our educational and advocacy work, please donate to Badan Warisan Malaysia. Details are available here on the screen. Thank you very much in advance for your kind support. Tax receipts are also available for your donation. On behalf of Badan Warisan Malaysia, we wish to express appreciation to our donors, supporters, and the team behind our Spotlight on Sarawak series. Thank you once again and enjoy your evening.